Hello everyone, welcome back. And today we're going to be going through why the 16personalities.com website doesn't give you consistent results when it comes to your personality type. Now, I know a lot of us who have been interested in cognitive functions for a long time look down on the letter dichotomies as being a bad way to measure personality, but I don't think that they're actually the worst if you can find a decent test to point you in the right direction of what your personality type might be. The best test that you can use is the official MBTI assessment, but I don't think the 16personalities.com website test is the worst if you know how to take the test. So today I kind of want to run you through the logic of why people don't get consistent test results on 16personalities.com, how they can better take the test, and the math behind that. Let's get into it. So what makes 16personalities.com struggle to give you results in regard to your personality type? Well, the type of scoring that they use throughout the assessment is what's known as a 7-point Likert scale. So a Likert scale is when you have a range of scores. For example, here we have agree to disagree, and then you're going to be scoring on any one of these points throughout each of the questions. Now, 7-point scoring scales for Likert scales are particularly problematic when they look at the type of assessment that we're measuring. So we're attempting to measure an assessment or a personality that has a side to it. You're either an introvert or an extrovert. You're an intuitive or a sensing type. You're a thinker or a feeler. Now, this is problematic because the 7-point version of a Likert scale has a middle point, which means that you can score in the middle. Another issue with 7-point Likert scales, or Likert scales in general, anything over 2, is going to be that it's much easier to not have consistent results or retest variability or variance. So say, for example, one day I'm feeling relatively social and I pick that it's easy for me to make friends. But the next day I come back and take the test and I say, well, you know what, maybe not, maybe I'm more neutral. That single score, that single difference that you just put, it doesn't look like much, throughout the course of the assessment can make a large difference in what your end score is going to be. So 16personalities.com uses what's known as a Likert scale style of scoring. Now, Likert scale is when you have a range of responses that represent where you lie and how much you agree or disagree with something. So say, for example, with a question of like, how social are you? You can score anywhere from 0 to 4. Now, you might be asking, why not 1 to 5, and why are we using 0 to 4? And that's because in psychology and statistics research, a 0 on the back end represents a 0th percentile or no preference for. And that's going to make it easier when we're trying to understand, when we're doing the math for this, essentially. So a 0 represents a 0th preference for 0th percentile. 1 would be a 25th percentile, or I kind of disagree. 2 would be a neutral response. 3 would be a kind of agree response, and 4 would be a fully agree response. Now, the way that you kind of find out someone's final score is you simply add up the percentiles of each of their responses and then divide that by the total number of questions that they asked. So let's say we have 5 questions that are all attempting to measure extroversion. Over here, you could see that someone responded with a 75th percentile score 4 times, and then a 50th percentile score. So what that would look like mathematically is 75 plus 75 plus 75 plus 50 equals 350. Divide that by 5, and you get 70th percentile. So on this particular questionnaire, this person scored 70th percentile in extroversion. Now that's great, and that's going to be okay, but the problem is that when you're using something that has this many responses, and when you're using something that has a middle response, you really run the risk of getting less reliability when someone is answering the questions, and that their responses are far more likely to change from, say, for example, here to here, or even further over between tests, because it's much easier to justify a small change over time than it is to justify a large change. So how is that going to be represented when we're looking at the same question, the same types of questions again? So even if you're looking at something like, is it easy for you to make friends? 0 disagree, 2 neutral, 4 agree, these types of questions. And we go through the same style of questions, but this time there's a slight difference in responses. You can see that this time they scored 1 as 25th percentile and 1 as the 0th percentile. Now we have 75 plus 75 plus 25 plus 75 plus 0 equals 250 divided by 5 equals 50th percentile. So now we have someone who scores exactly in the middle, And all that changed was a couple of responses to the questions. There's not really much changing, and you're going to see this huge variance in what their personality type might be. And that's something that's going to go across all the scales on the 16personalities.com website. So introversion, intuition, thinking, judging, these are all going to have the potential for variance because it's very easy to switch from one response to the other between tests. Now, is there a way to overcome this? Yes, but before I tell you the way to overcome this, I want to talk about how the actual MBTI asks questions and how you respond to them when you're taking the official MBTI assessment. But I do want to talk about, before we get into that real quick, the benefits of a scale like this, because this isn't to say that these types of questions, these types of scales are bad. What are these types of scales good for? They're great for something like Big Five, where you want very specific responses. You want very specific numbers. So on Big Five, you don't want to know which side of the coin do they land on. You want to know what is their exact number or percentage within that scale. So you're looking for like 67th percentile, 33rd percentile. Whereas in MBTI, you're looking for one side or the other. You're not trying to find that specific score. It might be like, quote unquote, interesting to know that score for the average person. But in reality, what the test should be aiming to do is find out which side of that you lie on, because the exact score really doesn't matter that much to the individual, because you want to find the side of the dichotomy that you are on. So now let's go into the actual MBTI style of questionings and see how that differs. Now, the actual MBTI assessment uses what's called forced choice response questions. So instead of a scale of like 0 to 4 or 1 to 5, you have two answers. You have 0 or 1. You have this or that, yes or no. And that might seem counterintuitive because as a test taker, you're thinking, well, what if I'm in the middle on a question? Or what if I, fall somewhere that doesn't represent each side of these questions? When you're using a forced choice style test or assessment, you have to kind of preemptively start by stating that not all of these responses are going to perfectly represent you as an individual. When you are taking this assessment, choose the answer that best represents you or is closest to you, not which is a perfect representation of you. When you're taking a Likert scale style of test like 16personalities.com, you want to choose the one, or they'll tell you to choose the one that is closest to you or the most specific. With a forced choice style of questioning, you're going to pick the one that is relatively close to you because the answers are going to be very, very different. They're not going to share any similarities because they're each one side of the spectrum. They're going to represent the 0th percentile and the 100th percentile. Let's look at an example of a question for this. In regard to friendships, it's 0, difficult to make new friends, or 1, easy to make new friends. As someone goes through a test and they're answering this style of question, so imagine we have 5 different questions that are very similar to this that are measuring extroversion versus introversion, they're going to have to really think, okay, is it more difficult for me to make new friends, or is it easier for me to make new friends? Is it difficult for me to be social, or easier for me to be social? They'll have to really choose which side of the coin that they're on. And as they go through the assessment, they'll pick one side or the other. And at the end of the assessment, this leads to a much more heavily weighted and consistent response. So say, for example, in this one, we have an 100th percentile, and 100th percentile, 0, 100, and 100. So 100 plus 100 plus 100 plus 0 plus 100 divided by 5 equals 80th percentile. And you'll notice that this is responses that are all within the same side of the test as the previous one that we were looking at a moment ago at the previous example. So there was one response on the left side in the Likert scale that we looked at a moment ago, but that test result had a 60th percentile. It was much less consistent or reliable. We can look at another question just that has 2 responses, just like the last example we looked at, where it was a 50th percentile response in the Likert scale, where there was 2 on the left side as opposed to 1. So now we have 100, 100, 0, 100, and a 0, which equals 300. And 300 divided by 5 is going to equal a 60th percentile score, which is different from the 50th percentile that we got from someone choosing the same amount of answers on the side that they chose on this one. And I know this is probably a lot of math and it's probably very confusing, but the general idea here is that with a forced choice style questionnaire and responses, you're going to have far more reliable and consistent results because you really, really have to choose which side you're on. And also because you really have to choose and you're not allowed to pick those middling responses, your answer is far less likely to change between test sessions. So someone might pick a 0 score on the Likert scale and then go to a 1, which could change their whole test result on a Likert style of questioning, but they're very unlikely to go from 0 to 1 on a forced choice. They're very likely to go from it's difficult for me to make new friends to it's easy for me to make new friends over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks. And that's what leads to the reliability and consistency of tests like the actual MBTI, which really force you to think about your answers to the question and then apply more mathematical weight to each of those responses. So does this mean that the 16 Personalities website is just kind of doomed to failure and you're never likely to find your personality letters at the very least when it comes to your MBTI type? And I do want to really stress and emphasize here that your letters can be a great indicator when you're first getting into MBTI to understand yourself a little bit before you deep dive into the cognitive functions. Because theoretically, as Brigg proposed, your letters should match your functions. If I look at an INTJ in terms of functions, they should still be an introvert, an intuitive, a thinking, and a judging type. So it's not like we should completely throw out letters as being completely disregardable when it comes to MBTI and finding your MBTI type. And I think that if you know how to take the 16personalities.com website, you can have a much more consistent look at what your personality type might be like. So how do you take the 16personalities.com website test if you want to have a more consistent result, if you want to maybe better know what your preferences are? Well, it's an easy answer. All you have to do is only pick in the extremes. Don't allow yourself to pick any of these center responses. If you want to know very well which of your preferences you prefer, only pick the extremes. Now, you might be saying, well, some of these I'm really, really in the center on. Okay, maybe allow yourself 1 or 2 pure centers, but completely avoid these. Completely avoid these right here, because these are going to be the things that give you inconsistent results. These are going to be the responses that put you from one side to the other as you take and retake this test. I'm willing to bet that there's going to be people out there that if they take it and they only respond to the extremes, and you take time thinking about every question that you answer, and you don't just go this, that, this, and you really think, which side am I on? You're very unlikely to go from, say, for example, agree to here or here or here. You might go from here to here, but you're very unlikely to go all the way across. So if you only respond with these big agrees or disagrees, you're far more likely to get a consistent result, which is going to help you find out what your letter preferences might be so you can understand a little bit about yourself before you deep dive into the cognitive functions.